Right. Great.
Oh, there we go. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I think we started talking about me giving this lecture well over 2 years ago. And for a variety of reasons, obviously, it's been deferred till now. Yes, I think a lot of what I'll be covering this evening will have certain resonances for how things have played out over the last 2 years, particularly a lot of the measures that may have seemed innovative and intrusive in our lives. But these are things that our ancestors lived with perennially during the 3 centuries with which Scotland was visited by recurring episodes of bubonic plague for the most part. And what I'm proposing to do tonight is take you through those 3 centuries, touching on aspects of how and when control measures were brought in, the nature of them, how it intruded on folks' lives. I'll be touching briefly on some of the other things that were adding into the mix, the pestilences and the poxes that were around at the same time. But the other aspect I will not be covering tonight is the other side of what I do, which is the environmental impacts, the climate change and things that are going on. And so in many ways, the two are, I'm treating them separately tonight, so you can't say they're inseparable, but you should see them as 2 sides of the same coin, and they are part and parcel of what made particularly the 14th century one of the grimmest periods to be alive, but also what made the late 16th and through the 17th century particularly unpleasant too. And I'll be looking at Scotland generally, but I'll be returning every now and then to particular circumstances as affected Perth or wider Perth and Kinross council area. But it's largely drawing on the evidence where we got it. The documentary record is best from places like Edinburgh and Stirling and Glasgow. There's some good material in Perth as well, but a lot of the juiciest council records, unfortunately, are of the period that haven't survived as well as we might have hoped. So, what is it? Well, what we're going to be looking at, there's been a lot of debate. If you go back even just 10 years ago, the great question was the medieval Black Death bubonic plague? And there were some folk who argued it was pretty well anything other. You had suggestions that it might be some variety of Ebola. Back in the 1960s, it was suggested it could be anthrax. And more plausibly, suggestions that there was large numbers of interrelated diseases, all acting like a kind of cocktail simultaneously. And in there you had typhus, yes, you had bubonic plague, you may have had smallpox and things like that, all interacting. But only relatively recently, in the last 10 years or so, they finally isolated DNA of the medieval plague, and yes, it is bubonic. So we now have a label that we can put confidently on it. So this is the bacillus. It was originally labeled Pasteurella pestis, discovered in 1894 in Hong Kong by one of the Pasteur Institute scientists, a young chap called Alexandre Yersin, a Swiss medic. And originally named generally after the Pasteur Institute. But then in 1944, he got the recognition that was his due, and it was named. I don't know whether he want to have a bacillus named after me, but anyway, old Alexandre got his Yersinia pestis. And right from, well, actually slightly earlier, from the 1870s, 1880s, it had been getting postulated that bubonic plague might be the medieval plague. And this was largely coming about through work that the British Imperial Medical Service had been undertaking in India, where bubonic plague was still endemic at that time. And they were noting the symptoms, they were noting the way in which it developed and comparing that to the records of the medieval illness. And so they were reasonably confident that they were the same. And then once you had the identification by Yersin, that argument began to grow arms and legs, and it became very, very fixed through the 20th century that this was the culprit. It's transmitted via fleas. They are the vector for this. And it would be the great Nosopsilus fasciatus. There's a picture of it in your screen there, the European rodent flea. And it's possible that it's also being transmitted through, all species have got their fleas. We have our own, we have Pulex irritans, the human flea. But it's the Nosopsilus, which is carried by the black rat primarily. Okay, so I was at the point where I was saying that the blackened area that you can see on the image is the blocked gut of the flea, and so the flea is ravenously hungry, but the only way that it can get any more nutrition is to regurgitate the infected blood, and what it does is it effectively vomits that up into the bloodstream of the new host, delivering the bacillus straight into its new victim. And if you are lucky, you will get the least virulent of the three varieties, because although we talk about bubonic plague, it comes in three flavors: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. Bubonic in the Middle Ages, now it's just treated with antibiotics. In the Middle Ages, this was the one that you might hope to get because there was a chance that you would survive it. It was the slowest operating one. It would take maybe 3 or 4 days for you to die as a result of it. Pneumonic is transmitted in aerosol droplets, a bit like COVID. And the problem with this one is it's a very rapid killer. And so if the pneumonic variety is around, it basically burns itself out because it kills the infected host too rapidly for them to spread it. The one that is actually the most difficult to transmit in yourself is the septicemic variety, but it's 100% fatal in any case, and kills you within 24 hours if you develop that particular variety. So those were the ones that were doing the rounds. It's mainly bubonic that we would be seeing because that is the slowest spreader. And the key thing to bear in mind is there is no human acquired immunity to this. So you got bubonic plague once and survived. If it came along again, you could get it again, and you would not have any natural immunity that has been built up to it. So now, why is it not advancing? Right. Okay, there we go. So when this first begins to spread out of basically the Caucasus, now modern Ukraine, Crimea area, it's already come westwards from probably Mongolia, Manchuria, where it is endemic. It's come along the trade routes. It's moved with the great Mongol hordes across this territory. It gets into places like Kaffa in the Crimea, and from there it's into the European trade route system. It's from there into Constantinople, right through the Mediterranean. 1347-48, it's spreading up through Europe. It's into England by 1348, and the Scots are absolutely gleeful. This is what they're referring to as the foul death of England. And then the following year, 1349, of course, it arrives in Scotland and everybody stops dancing in the streets with joy. And in Scotland, you've got relatively little written evidence for it. You've got the chronicles, what's called Gesta Annalia II, that's embedded into the chronicle that most people know as John of Fordun. And then that's taken up as well by Walter Bower and Andrew of Winton. So you've got those three chronicle collections. And they really devote about a paragraph, a relatively short paragraph, saying how terrible it is, but all of them, nearly 1/3 of the whole human race die. Now, what does that mean? Because the number, a third, if you just go down that list, you'll see a third keeps on turning up. What it means is a great many people. And there's been a lot of debate again about what that meant in reality. There was a bit of a minimalist backlash in the 60s and 70s. Shrewsbury, the great epidemiologist of the 1970s, argued that it might be as low as 20%. That only 20% of people dying, not a problem. But the number has gradually come back up as more work has been done on record evidence from Italy, from France, from England. And the number is, in some areas, it may be as high as 60% or above. In other areas, it may be as low as about 30%. And if we're taking what does that mean for Scotland during the great mortality of 1349 to 51-2, Scotland then had a population, the estimates are somewhere between 670,000 and 750,000. So somewhere in the vicinity of 230 to 250,000 people died in Scotland alone in that first epidemic. So you survive that, and then 10 years later, you have got what's referred to as the pestis secundis, the second mortality, and again, nearly a third. There'd been no bounce back in population, so your population's already dropped, say, to around about 500,000. You lose another 150 to 180,000 people in that epidemic. And this is happening right across Europe. And then 1380, another. So the surviving numbers are dropping each time. There is no recovery in the population level. And population remains at this lower level, probably somewhere in the order of 350 to 400,000 for the remainder of the medieval and into the early modern period. So it has a profound impact, whichever way you want to look at it. It transformed the entire face of Europe. And even although people clearly begin to live with it by the end of the 14th century, you've got recurring epidemics right through the 15th and 16th century, every 7 to 10 years or so. And they're not short. They're moving around the country, ebbing and flowing, a bit like what we've just been experiencing over an average of around about 2 to 3 years. And the last epidemic occurs right in the middle of the Civil War period in the 1640s. And it is devastating. And part of the problem is you've got various armies moving around through Scotland at this time. And those armies are acting as the transmitters of plague. And you can follow the plague around the country, following the routes of the Royalist and the Covenanting armies within Scotland. So now, just to put things into context, it's not just plague. There's a whole variety of other pestilences, particularly in the 15th century. We've got, right at the beginning of the century, we've got what appears to be a major epidemic of some variety of dysentery. The victims are described as dying in profluvio ventris, which means with a great outpouring of the bowels. So sort of rather graphic imagery for you. And you might also, you've had a suggestion that what you have is Vibrio cholerae, cholera. This is coming in 1439. And this is the thing referred to as the Wame ill. Your Wame is your stomach, your belly, your guts. And so this is first striking. 1402 is the dysentery, and then through the 1430s you've got this Wame ill. Smallpox, it had been around for centuries, millennia, but it comes and goes in waves, and it seems to be going through a major resurgence in the 1430s. It's spreading like wildfire around Europe. And we know that tens of thousands of people die in London, in Paris, in smallpox epidemics again in the 1430s. There's a disease, we don't know exactly what it was, that hit Scotland in 1431 and 1432, described as the flying sickness. And it had been suggested this was some kind of viral influenza, but it's more likely, it's about the speed of the transmission. It's more likely to have been smallpox. And it may be smallpox is the one that's referred to down at the borders as the Boch. And in Perth, there's one that's puzzled me for ages, is this thing referred to as the Malach's pest. And the nearest I can find for this word Malach is it's something that comes into Scots from Gaelic, and it relates to sort of small speckling crumbs. So it may be a measles type illness, or it may be smallpox that we're seeing there. And then, you're right at the end of the 15th century, we've got the New World's gift. We gave them smallpox. They gave us Treponema pallidum, the syphilis, the venereal variety. Non-venereal syphilis had been present in Europe for centuries, but this variety almost definitely came back in Columbus's ships, and his sailors merrily spread it through the harbours of the Mediterranean, and then from there into the ranks of the mercenaries who spread it up through Europe. And by 1498, it's arrived in the north of Scotland. Actually, it's there from 1496. You've got the good burgesses of Aberdeen passing laws to control, to regulate brothels, regulate behaviour generally, try and staunch its spread, because there's no experience of this disease. So it is spreading like wildfire. There's no built up immunity within the European population to it. And it is devastating. It's a killer in this first onslaught. In Edinburgh, you get the ordering of all the syphilitics to assemble on the pier and shorehead at Leith for transportation to Inchkeith Island, where God would provide for them. We've got no record that anyone turned up to be transported out to the island. And this is disease, it's referred to by the early 16th century as Grangor. It was hugely feared. Its slower development and the late onset of its most clearly visible symptoms meant its psychological impact, though, never reached the scale of the plague. It was something that, you know, it's a gradual build-up. It's not killing thousands of people within a few days. It's taking a long time to have an effect, but it was a devastating effect. It was mainly the younger, mobile members of the population, the people who provided a lot of the labour, and so economically, this could actually be quite a major blow to Scotland when it arrived. But let us return to the plague. And, you know, surprisingly, it's Scotland where you seem to have this, you know, relatively low-key response to the plague amongst the chroniclers. There's only a few charters that mention, you know, the fevered times in which we live, or the strangeness of the times. Elsewhere around Europe, there's all this, you know, huge outpouring of just disbelief and horror and outrage at this. But, you know, Scotland, very, very low key. And yet it's in Scotland that you get the first central government type of attempt to respond to plague, to set in place measures whereby people can actually get some kind of protection, look after themselves. And the Crown, through Parliament, is delegating this to local authorities. So you don't get the Crown instructing, it's just, right, you've been given the powers, use them locally. If there is a threat, you have got the magistrates of the borough, or if it's a Lord of a Regality jurisdiction, they have got the right to start the control measures. And this comes in a general council held in Edinburgh on the 19th of October, 1456. Now, what they're doing is not innovatory. This had been circulating mainly in Italy with very advanced medical treatment in Italy. A lot of understanding there about sanitary control measures and things like that. So the Scots are picking this up nearly a century after the first great epidemic, but it is still 60 years in advance of Tudor England having the same kind of legislation introduced down there. And this 1456 series of empowerment is probably the best way to look at them. That remains the basis of Scottish responses to every epidemic all the way through to 1645-48. And after that, I mean, it remained in force until 1707, but it never needed to be redeployed after 1648. So just to emphasize, it's enforcement locally. And what we see from the records is it's no laissez-faire approach, real rigor in the application of this. And you know, when you think about possible lockdown parties and breaches like that, given that, as we shall see shortly, that punishment for breaching some of the anti-plague spreading measures was hanging, it's something that, you know, people in power might want to think about. So this is it. I'm not expecting you to read it. I'm not going to read it, but you can get this from the Records of the Parliaments of Scotland website. And you know, really, it's mainly common sense. It's about you know, people who are infected quarantining. They can be put out of their house, out of the town, out to the common muir if things are getting out of hand, but they're not to be put out of their house without reason. There's attempts to prevent people burning properties willy-nilly. There's a real attempt to try and stop infected people from just moving around freely and infecting others. So there's a recognition that you want to keep the plague contained as much as possible. And so if folk flee the plague, you as a magistrate, your responsibility is to round them up and bring them back, because it is your civic duty to make sure that you're not endangering people more generally. And then you've got attempts at, I'd say, burning property, what's believed to be infected property, because it was believed that the illness, whatever it was saturated into goods, particularly cloth, soft furnishings, things of that kind. And actually, one of the most critical things is right there at the end, and that the prelates make general processions. So they're not looking for a medical cure, they're looking for a divine cure. And so it would be the senior clergy were to process with saints' relics. And that remains all the way down to the Reformation. And then post-Reformation, it is still the church that is organizing national fasts, prayers, humiliations, as they're called. And they're taking a very, very severe line on anybody who breaches those. And we see this, you know, just as an example, around about 1500, there's an epidemic that's raging from about 1496 through to, in different parts of the country, down to about 1505. And round about 1500, we don't have the precise year, Bishop George Brown up in Dunkeld, he responded to the threat. Now, it's a good PR job for the cathedral because he takes the relics of St. Columba that are kept at the cathedral on tour. But he also does a series of practical things. The parish of Dunkeld itself, not the diocese, which covers most of northern Perthshire, but the parish of Dunkeld, Little Dunkeld as it was, is on both sides of the Tay. So it's on the Burnham side of the river from the cathedral. But it extended all the way up almost to Pitlochry. So the territory of Dowley is part, and also it extends further downriver and includes Capeth. So he carves off Dowley and Capeth and sets them up as a new parish. And this is to stop the people from those areas having to pass through Dunkeld to get to the only bridge over the river to get to the parish church, because he doesn't want potentially infected people coming into the cathedral city. So it's a good, practical, logical step. But as I said, he also takes the relics, and the image there on the what's my left is, we can see the reliquary shrine of St. Columba that would have sat above the high altar in the cathedral. And he takes bones from that. And there are stories told. Alexander Milne, the biographer of the bishops of Dunkeld, he tells how two men in Capeth refused to take the water that the bones had been dipped into that was meant to provide a cure. Everybody else in the parish took it. Everybody else in the parish survived. Those two died very, very shortly after of plague. Great PR, because it brought all the offerings in, people looking for the protection of St. Columba against this disease. And so processions like this would be happening in every town. In Perth itself, you would have, well, the people from the three friaries. By the time they're all up and running, you'd have Carthusian monks, you would have the clergy from St. John's Kirk. Any relics that they have got are going out in procession with them. You're getting public humiliations, people basically appealing to God for a release from this. And as I was saying, right through, even after the Reformation, the church is still taking a lead in responses to plague. And you've got all these references to debauchers, to gluttons, riotous livers and merrymakers, because these are the folk who are having a good time and partying, and they are threatening, both from the fact that they themselves, by gathering in large numbers, might be then transmitters of disease. Sound familiar from the last couple of years, but also through their ignoring of the religious injunctions, they're bringing down more divine wrath upon their fellows. So it's fines and public penance, if you're lucky, for those people. Now, what we see, taking that 1456 series of enactments, is through from the second half of the 15th century down into the 17th century, it's the boroughs that we see the best evidence in. And what they're doing is they're introducing measures are particularly around individual movement, freedom of movement. So you think back to the first lockdown and movement within your own council area, if you were lucky, but no more than 5 miles from home and this kind of thing. This was, in the Middle Ages, a blanket ban on travel and trade between infected areas and uninfected areas. There was controls on gatherings of people, on the numbers of people who could gather together in one place. And that also included school closure, again, as a resonance with what we have been through. The one that wasn't recently was the control of vermin. The definition of vermin is very interesting. It includes children under the age of 13. It's got more to do with they're associated with dirt and playing in the muck. But then there is formal organization of cleansing or cleansing, including council provision of cauldrons for boiling suspected infected good. You've got the organization of area watch teams and inspectors, senior members of the community who are charged with basically spying on their neighborhood and reporting anyone who breached any of the regulation. And then there's imposition of quarantine. Now, we're talking quarantine, real quarantine, not 10 days. This was a 40-day quarantine. And people being almost literally boarded up in houses or forced to go out to live in shacks on the equivalent of the North or South Inch for the duration of their quarantine. There's all sorts of attempts to disinfect, fumigation, often got out of hand, people burning piles of damp heather in houses, and then the whole house burns down. We've got records of that in Dundee and in Ayr. You've got instructions for goods to be washed in rinned water, running water, or left out in particularly frosty conditions because extreme cold and extreme heat and smokiness was meant to cleanse. And this is an extract from the Edinburgh Council Register. It's published, but from March 1498, and it shows the way in which intelligence gathering is central to the control measures. So they've heard that there is infection in towns and villages round Edinburgh. So there's no allowance for any movement. So it's Curry, Craman, Grantley, Dreghorn, and what's now Westerhales. That area is prevented from anybody coming into the town to trade. And people within Edinburgh are given strict instructions. You are not to allow anybody, if you know that they've been from these areas, they are not to stay with you. If you bring them in on your own head, literally be it. And it could be the end of you as a Burgess of Edinburgh. Down there at the end, under the pain of burning of all their movable goods and banishing of this town for all the days of their life. So, real severe penalties for breaches. And we see this being strengthened. It's each time there is a reissuing of the bylaws within the borough, we see a ramping up. So you've got a prohibition on anyone of any degree. So that includes the councillors who are making these rules. So they're trying to live by the rules that they set. So anyone of any degree to receive anyone in their house without prior permission of the council. The watches are organised, and the penalties for breaching any of the movement controls, cutting of their ears, burning of their cheeks, and banishing from the town. Prohibition on sales of English cloth. This isn't xenophobia, it's just that cloth, it was believed that the infection could be literally saturated into the cloth. So England had the infection, therefore cloth coming from England carried a high risk, therefore it was seized and burned. And there you've got the prohibition on children under the age of 13 running loose. And so they weren't, and it was the parents who were held responsible, and the parents would be imprisoned for their children's failures. There's a curfew imposed strictly. You had to have a very, very good reason going about your lawful business. Closing of licensed premises. Again, it really sounds very, very much like what was happening over the last 2 years. So all taverns and alehouses closed immediately, and schools also being closed, and there to remain until God provide. So once again, and it strengthened further. So dogs and pigs to be kept confined, strays to be killed on sight, constraints on children extended and directed against the child as well as the parents this time, but the age limit's gone up, so it's every child under the age of 15. School closures enforced, because there were people, these are private schools, and people lived on the income, and of course they've been trying to stay open during the ban, but they're now, if you breach it, you're permanently exiled from the town. And then strict controls on retail activity, limiting hours of trade, what can be traded, and how you go about buying and selling. And again, it all has a very, very strong flavour of the now. There was already concern in the 1500s about the long-term impact of school closure, because heaven forfend, this might mean that we'd have too few people able to be lawyers or enter the clergy, because it's Latin training that they're particularly concerned about. But the first parliamentary measures to try and remedy this don't occur until 1607. And it's still with that, you're trying to train up the clergy, but also trying to train the legal profession. We see things that had been locally enforced are being nationally enforced, but you hear again from the Perth Kirk Session book, 24th of May 1585, there's a prohibition on banquets and marriages and engagement feasts and things of that kind. And again, it's the recognition that these were opportunities for large numbers of people coming from all different parts of the community and the country round about would gather together, potentially get infected and take the disease back with them to their home territories. So it's limits on a number, and here you've got, 4 on the side to the banquet or bridal for the duration of the epidemic. Similarly, going back to the 1490s, funerals were big deals. These were major social events, great gatherings, particularly if it was somebody of status. And you have got a prohibition, blanket prohibition on large gatherings for funerals. And right through here in 1646 in Glasgow, that there be nae meeting at lick wakes nor after burials, so that wakes are forbidden, as well as large numbers of people attending the actual interment. And the way in which this was dealt with, any breaches rather were dealt with, is quite profound, quite draconian. Right from the outset, there's record of people trying to avoid the worst controls. You've got records in Stirling of people breaking holes in the back walls of their own property so they could run away. But other people would report and they would be brought back, as the 1456 law required. But the punishment for breaches, fines, and the fines, even for a poor person, were already at a very, very high level. But they could go all the way up to full forfeiture of all your worldly goods, including your house. Branding, ear clipping, flogging, expulsion from the community could be for a period of time or permanent. Now, this is almost as bad as being outlawed, because you would lose your entire livelihood. If you were a member of one of the guilds, you could only practice your craft in your borough. You couldn't just relocate from Perth to Dundee, say. And then loss of burgess privileges that goes along with that. But you do have execution. Men tended to be hanged, women were often drowned. So in Edinburgh, we've got in 1530, there were 2 women were executed because they had done a house clearance of somebody who died of plague and were selling on goods from the house that were potentially infected. And so for that crime, they were drowned in the flooded quarry pits down on the south side of the town. And a tailor, same year, he actually escaped execution, because what happened with him, he hadn't reported that his wife had been ill. She died, and he left her corpse in the house while he went to mass at St. Giles, knowing that he had been in the presence of a dead infected corpse. This was found out, and so the council ordered him to be hanged in front of his door. The rope broke. They got another rope. It broke. They tried a third time, and it broke. So this was clearly a sign that God wanted him to survive. So he was flogged, branded, and expelled for life from the town along with his children. So better for him to be made a penniless beggar than just to be executed. We also start to see evidence through the late 15th, 16th, and very much in the 17th century for what we might want to regard as PPE. But from the 1490s, there's professional cleansers in operation. And there's a whole new set of laws set in place to control how they operate. They've got to live apart from everybody else. They have to wear special clothes and carry signs to show who they are, so that people can avoid them for the duration of the epidemic. They're literally being paid danger money for what they're doing. So it was a well-paid operation, but of course you stood a very, very high chance of not living to reap the benefits of the additional income. But they also became targets. And very interestingly, you've got its grave diggers, cleansers, and nurses who were amongst those who were most often attacked by other people during these times. because there was always a suspicion that they were deliberately spreading the plague because it kept them in employment and they profited as a result. You'll have seen, this particular face mask is from Linn in Germany, but these are typical of the 17th century, and they would have been worn by physicians in the larger boroughs like Dundee and Edinburgh in the 17th century. And it's to try to protect them from that great long bird's beak would have been stuffed full of highly perfumed, spiced material, and this is meant to prevent them from breathing in the fume that is carrying the contagion. And the glasses that they're wearing is literally to prevent them from being coughed or spat in the eye and potentially picking up infection in that way. So it's all breathing filters, PPE by any other name. But it's a very, very highly organized system, and we really need to give credit to what our ancestors were doing. There's a lot of requirement to give formal notification, again, a bit like our test and trace kind of arrangement. And so if somebody in the house fell sick, even if it possibly wasn't plague, you had to report it to the neighborhood visitors and searchers, and then they would inspect the sick person. And we know in the early 1500s up in Aberdeen, sick or recovering people were required to stand naked in front of the searchers, who would then inspect them quite minutely to see if there was any visible signs on their skin for the telltale marks of plague. And if they did see it, you then were put out of the town or into quarantine. If anyone died, particularly in unexpected circumstances, they had to notify the authorities, who would then come and inspect the corpse. And you get the appointment of male searchers going around. It's quite a social control kind of thing as well. But for decency's sake, when it was dead, it was a male and a female searcher would go to inspect the corpse. There is an absolute requirement, regardless of your social status, that you obeyed everything you were told to do by the searchers. Failure to do that, again, a financial punishment. If you're at the bottom end of the social ladder, this was where you really had to worry, particularly in the 16th and 17th century, because areas that were regarded as vermin infested, and this is Mary King's Close, if you know your Edinburgh tours, basically being blocked up, and you had to fend for yourself. You either died or you survived. No happy medium in between. And so they were just simpliciter, contemnit, and stick it up, blocked off. We've got a lot of evidence from within council minute books for the costs. Down in Ayr, the council is paying for the use and the cleansing of the muir onto which people went when they were infected. The shacks, the wood that the shacks are built out of, that was council property. In Edinburgh, they stored it in the toll booth cellar, so they didn't have to go to the expense of buying new wood the next time there was an epidemic. They paid for extra watchmen. They were really necessary with all the control measures. And they were also the ones to make sure that if there was going to be a burning of a house, the fire didn't spread beyond that. People, most of the time, would be confined within their own house for their quarantine period. But if numbers were rising too rapidly within the borough, that's when you would be pushed outside. So in Stirling, for example, they're down on the end of what's now Causeway Head Road, leading into the bridge over the Forth. It's putting them beyond sort of coughing distance of the risk of infection for the rest of the town. But they're not just put out there and left to rot and die and what have you. They've got their money and things with them. They're able to buy food, but they've also got the most important thing. They've got spiritual care and support. 15.2 here in Stirling at the Bridge End. You get the setting up of the chapel of one of the new popular plague saints, St. Roch. The king is paying for the establishment of a chapel of St. Roch, so that they'll be praying for the infected and for the souls of the deceased, which is part of the curing process as much as medical provision as we would understand it. The most important one of these is St. Roch's Chapel on the Borough Muir of Edinburgh. This is an 18th century engraving of the ruins there. And then in Glasgow, again, you've got St. Roch's or St. Rollock's. Anytime you go on the train into Queen Street Station, you're going over the site of Glasgow's Foul Muir, where infected Glaswegians were required to take themselves off. And even small communities. We've got a wonderfully well-recorded case down at Ratho, not Ratho Station, down on the A8 by Turnhouse Airport, Edinburgh Airport rather. It's Old Ratho up over the hill. But they're in competition with the folk of Gogar, which is out where the Royal Bank of Scotland offices are. Over the Common Muir, it's shared grazing between them. And when some men of Ratho were infected with plague, they were put into booths on the moor, but the men of Gogar drove them off because they thought they were going to lose the use of the grazing. So there's a lot of hostility towards infected people as well, because it's the fear that they engendered within the wider community, the fear of loss of earnings, the fear of loss of life. And we've got numerous locations where people are being moved out. Again, in Dundee, you've got St. Roch's Chapel. You've got the surviving town gate, not in its original position, but traditionally this is where George Wishart preached from the gate to the infected outside the town. And the burial is taking place at the Holy Rood Chapel and its burial ground, which is out on the Arbroath Road here at Roodyards, the 18th century cemetery. But somewhere in here, you've got the plague pits of the 16th century and 17th century epidemics for Dundee. Aberdeen really pursued a very effective plague control measure from the early 16th century all the way through to the 1640s. It managed to avoid the high mortalities of elsewhere. And certainly in the early 1500s, a lot of this has got to do with the presence in the university, the newly founded University of Aberdeen, of the first medical faculty in the British Isles. But here you see the ruins of the sick house up here on the road out to Old Aberdeen from the town centre. They're not just for plague victims. They originally were leper hospitals. So Perth Leper Hospital, somewhere in the Potter Row area, probably functioned as the sick house in plague times as well. And then they're also used for syphilitic victims and other similar infectious diseases. We've got, as I've already said, this rise of suspicion of other people, mainly folk from the lower social classes. There's this great fear of the poor and their filth, as it's labelled. And you start to see through the early 1500s particularly an awful lot more movement towards getting rid of undesirables, people that you don't know. So it's fear of strangers, fear of newcomers. So in Stirling, all strangers and others, it's others keep on coming up, that are not known within the borough, are just expelled. Regardless of the legitimacy of your presence there or otherwise, you're expelled. The borough's own poor are given tokens for their identification. And they could be picked out and yes, given support if necessary. This was sort of an extension of the poor protection that existed at the time. But outsiders, who breached this, if they kept on coming back. First offence, flogged, branded. But if you keep repeating it, you could be hanged simply for trying to survive by coming into the town to beg for alms. We've also got, through the later 16th century, post-Reformation, evidence for places that, for want of a better term, they are quarantine hotels. So post-1560, Inchcolm Abbey here in the Firth of Forth, no longer occupied by the Augustinian canons, is being used as a place where crewmen from quarantining ships were required to undergo their 40 days quarantine. And their ships, and just like today, quarantine at your own expense. Their ships as well also had to be cleansed, and so they would be bored, drilled, so that they sank in shallow water, and salt water would be used to cleanse the holds and any goods in the holds you hoped it wasn't perishable. And then at low water, the holes would be filled up and the ship would be refloated. But we've got multiple cases of people trying to avoid this as a ship comes into Perth at the end of the 16th century, where the crew is eventually rounded up and hanged for having defied the quarantining requirements and put the people of Perth and the surrounding country at risk. There's major constraints, as you might guess then, on trade locally as well as internationally. And merchants are complaining right from the 1340s onwards about the impact of control measures on their business. We've got a great case through in Irvine in June 1500, where you've got the merchant Adam Moultrar, who says to the council in Irvine, if you don't let me trade, I'm just going to leave. And they say, on you go. And he doesn't. But it's part of that thing. He's trying to get them to give him a special exemption, but they won't do it because the fear of the plague arriving in their town is enough to make them have a united front. That if anybody breaches this, it would be that the thin end of the wedge. More people would then want to find exemptions. But with this, you also see the introduction into Scotland of health passports, and again, there's a lot of resonance with now. Here, of course, in the 1500s, you didn't have vaccination, but what you got was a letter, a testimonial, which said you are free of illness, you're free of infection, you're free of plague, and it's signed by senior men, and the borough seal is put on it. And then when you arrive at your destination, you have to present it to the borough authorities at that end, who would then sign off on it and seal it when you left, because you would not get back into your hometown unless you were able to show that you had got their literal seal of approval, that you were clean, as it was termed, for your return. Now, the impact of this kind of control was massive, and we shouldn't underestimate the reality of the hardship that it caused. And just as revenue take, interesting, Perth and Kinross Council will be setting its budget in the next few weeks, but the rates, revenues and things like that have suffered during the pandemic. That is happening back in the late medieval, early modern period. St Andrews, for example, it's already on its uppers post-Reformation because all the church courts and things have gone. The university is not doing too well because they've gone and founded one in Edinburgh instead. And they appeal, they've got next to no revenues, and the harbour gets damaged. They don't have the money to be able to repair it. They have to go to the Convention of Local Authorities as equivalent, the Convention of Royal Boroughs of Scotland, to get a cash donation to pay for the harbour so that they're going to be able to continue to trade. In Perth, well, if you think about what is happening in terms of population, the 1580-45 outbreak, 1,400 townsfolk die. That's probably not far off half, maybe a third of the population for that time. You've got hundreds of deaths at a time. These are people of all social stations. It includes your craftsmen, some of your merchants. And so this is going to have an impact on borough income generation. And it's one of the contributors, apart from the fact that the councillors were trying to pocket a lot of the money for themselves, but it's one of the reasons why the bridge is not being maintained properly. And you get the collapse in the early 1600s and 150 years of reliance on using ferry boats to cross the river, or hope that there's a very, very low tide in a drought period to get across the Tay. Now, so much attention has been paid to the first, second, third pandemics back in the 14th century. The 17th century, 16th and 17th century epidemics tend not to be discussed very much in most historical discourse. And yet the mortality levels in the particularly the 1645-8 epidemic are huge. Dundee, the second city of the kingdom in the 17th century, is devastated during the war. It loses around 20% of its population from the epidemic, and then you've got the sack of the town by the Cromwellian army on top of that. Brechin, during the same epidemic, from the council records, from the records of burials, loses something like 60% of its adult population in the outbreak there. And Leith, we've got the session clerk is recording all the deaths, and we have 2,736 people exactly. That's approximately half of the town's population dies in that epidemic. And he has the wonderful statement: the number of the dead exceeds the number of the living, and amongst them it cannot be discerned what are clean and what are foul. So we don't know amongst the surviving ones who might actually be carrying the plague. And this is where we come, I'm nearly at the end here. Say Renaissance Man meets Club 1830. This is the armies, and it's large numbers of young men living in a group. Their levels of personal hygiene are not necessarily at the most desirable level, and even the army of God in the Army of the Covenant has its own procession of camp followers, as they're euphemistically called, in terms of the prostitutes that are in the trail of the army. There's all kinds of infection is rife. Plague is amongst them. Some of it might be typhus, and that's the Rickettsia bacterium, and it's transmitted by yet more of the human species hangers-on, literally the head louse and the pubic louse. And we know that David Leslie's army, when it's on the march through the Central Highlands and down through Campbell territory, that it is taking typhus with them. And you can see it all through the Campbell Glenorchy territories, round into the Earl of Argyll's territories, as they're pursuing the Royalist army down Kintyre, down to Dunaverty and back. And it takes over a decade for the Campbell estates to recover from the population losses and the income losses that resulted from that. And if you go to Fortingall, you'll get, over the road from the hotel in the field, you've got the burial mound with the stone. They talk about this as being from the Black Death. It is almost definitely a plague burial pit from the 45-48 outbreak, because again, both the Royalist and the Covenanting army is coming through this district in the 1640s. Along with this, you've also got a great upsurge in people trying to find remedies. Lots of self-help guides. The most important for Scotland is the publication of the first handbook for plague control, Gilbert Skeen's In Brief Description of the Pest. He got massive amount of money for this for the time, but basically he plagiarized the whole thing and put it into modern Scots at the time from the 1360s Middle English and Latin texts of Sir John de Mandeville. But we know that there are other things in circulation within the parchment record from Paisley Abbey, for example. You've got the 15th century A Noble Treatise Against Pestilence, which is giving you, dietary suggestions, what sorts of things to do to avoid putting yourself physically in the kind of condition where you'll be more susceptible to plague. But it's when we get down into the 1630s, just before that last big outbreak, then is when we actually start to get some proper medics thinking about how better to control this. And the key chap is Theodore de Mayerne in the 1630s, who comes up with all kinds of new measures for plague control. Unfortunately, he's advancing them just on the eve of the Civil War, and so none of them were put into operation as a consequence. And the result, 1645 to 48, was probably the last sting in the tail of plague for the people of Scotland. And this monument from St Machair's Cathedral in Aberdeen, the triumph of King Death over the failing populace of the city. So on that note, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Would you like to stop sharing your screen?
Yep.
Great. Now, do you want to read the questions on the chat, or shall I read them to you?
I'll just get the chat up. I will. Right.
Well,
yeah.
Yes, if people have any more, please put them on.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of work is being done, mainly in France, but you've also got the Max Planck, the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig is one of the key centres that's doing exactly this work. Yeah, it's basically the vectors that you've got kicking around. It's anything that is going to be puncturing the skin and is transmitting blood and other fluids. Is going to be playing a key part in that. And yes, within clothing and textiles, and this gives a certain sense of understanding as to why they are so panicked. That now they don't know it's the fleas, they think it is a miasma type of. So for example, in the 16th century, an explanation for an outbreak of plague up in Easter Ross is there'd been a shipwreck, and in that shipwreck there was a barrel full of onions, and the strong smell of the onions had attracted all this filth of the plague into it. And when they opened the barrel, this was all released into the local population. It's likely that in amongst that shipwreck there may actually have been infected members of the crew, but that's not given much credence in this. Although you've got individuals there's usually it's in Pole, call it Pavel, so it's somebody from Gdansk, that there's a lot of fear of transmission from the Baltic, and so you've got the descriptions mainly from the plagues in Edinburgh, that it's an individual who's bringing it in, doesn't know he's got it, goes into a house, he's found dead in bed, and then the folks sell his goods, and it's the goods that have been infected with the plague. So yeah, David, it's the personal belongings, particularly fabrics. Grain is another one, and that comes from the British Imperial Medical Service. They found that there is actually the vermin that are living amongst the grain. The rats, and I mean not fleas or anything like that, but those rats, of course, have got the fleas that are then transmitting it on.
Okay, sorry. For the next question, could you perhaps just read it out, or because
Oh, right. Okay.
I'm not quite sure what you're answering.
So I thought everybody could see the chat.
They can, but
So
I'm not sure.
David's also asked, I thought there was some human immunity, at least until the next variant arrived. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case in the medieval plagues. So you've got people who survive at one time, die of it the next time. And interestingly, this is something I didn't touch on, just about susceptibility to plague. There's a very, very strong possibility that the people who are affected in the first great mortality have been people who are effectively immunodeficient because they had grown up during the famine years between 1315 and 1322, and then as a consequence of the Great European Cattle Plague, which lasted down to 1325, they're not getting the milk proteins, which give you certain amounts of, that provides you with a lot of the boosted immune systems. So you've got a whole generation of people who are susceptible to an illness. So you've got a heightened mortality amongst them. And interestingly, the second mortality is described as mainly affecting men. So there may be variants at work, as you suggest there, David. It's just as SARS-CoV has a direr effect on men of a certain age, but mainly men. So too, something seems to be happening, and this is reported all over Europe. So it's not just one or two observers noting that, oh, there's 32 canons of St Andrews have all dropped dead of plague. Well, yeah, you're not going to get any female canons, so it's general population observation that's been going on. If taverns were closed, how did people get fluid? Water was presumably fairly dodgy at that time. Well, that's partly an 18th and 19th century myth. That there is a lot of water drinking throughout, but ale, remember, around about half of households in Scotland would have been brewing their own ale, and it's something. Elizabeth Ewan's done a huge amount of work on this from the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. And the number of women and widows who have a sideline to bring in additional income. So they're brewing things up. People are drinking ale not because it's boiled water, it's calories. That's drinking of ale was one of the primary sources for the daily calorific intake. So in parts of Europe, ales are described as liquid bread. So there's a lot of mythology about that. Certainly by the 19th century, in places like Edinburgh, I would be very worried about drinking the public water supply without boiling it, especially as a lot of the water is coming out of the Norloch. But water is relatively clean, and given that most people are going to be probably picking up an awful lot more daily bacteria than we do now in our over disinfected sterile houses, they probably had a much higher level of natural immunity to some of the milder food poisoning kinds of things. How did institutions and organizations maintain their function after sudden death of a third of their leadership structures? The answer is with a great deal of difficulty in some places. In Scotland, we don't have a huge amount of evidence. We really have to rely on what happens in England. And so you've got emergency ordinations. There's even occasional permissions given by bishops to senior nuns to hear confessions and things like that, which wouldn't normally happen. We know in the 1402 dysentery outbreak, 2 out of 3 of the bailies in Dundee dies. And they're also operating as customers. So they have to suspend the submission of the customs records from Dundee that year because the one remaining senior councillor doesn't have the information. The other two had it, and of course it's in the house and it's infected, so they're not going to want to go in there to get the material. The best way, and this is something we see from 1362-3, was a lot of the most senior people just hightailed it out of there, even though they too were meant to stay put. So 1362, King David II and his court head to Aberdeenshire, and he spends most of his time through the winter months from 1362 into 63, moving back and forth between Kildrummy Castle in Mar and Elgin. So, and when plague begins to move up into the north of the country and it's dying down in the south, he then moves back down to Edinburgh. Paranoid old James VI, he's the worst offender of them all. And you know, he plays sort of like a game of hopscotch. He starts out in Edinburgh, plague in Edinburgh, he moves to Linlithgow, plague in Linlithgow, he moves to Dunfermline, plague in Dunfermline, he moves to Falkland, plague in Falkland, he moves to Dundee, plague in Dundee, he moves to Perth, plague in Perth, he moves to Stirling, and then when plague reaches Stirling, he moves back to Edinburgh. It's just sort of a mad merry-go-round, but there's a lot of attempt to try to make sure that it's only the king and his immediate retinue. You don't have every nobleman, Tom, Dick and Harry following them as well. But that way, you know, the king, the chancellor, the senior members of the Privy Council, they're not dying. So you've at least got continuity in government. Colin MacLeod, although there was no understanding of microbiology at the time, most of the control measures and regulations to prevent plague demonstrate a genuine understanding of how disease is spread. Was plague never blamed on witchcraft? Absolutely. There's less so in Scotland. There's less evidence in the early period, but in mainland Europe, there's a huge amount of scapegoating takes place. The first two outbreaks in the 1340s and the 1360s see major pogroms against Jewish populations. It's believed to be a Jewish conspiracy, the poisoning of wells, and an attempt to destroy the Christian population. There's, you know, QAnon would have had a field day back then because it's also linked to a satanic conspiracy, and this is where the witches come in. So yeah, and the scapegoating extends through. It's the same mentality that leads to the accusations against grave diggers and nurses and people of that kind. Scotland has no pogrom because there's no Jewish population in Scotland, or the British Isles actually, from the late 13th century. So you just found it's mainly the poor, the people on the margins, and the women who are generally accused of witchcraft tend to be women who are on the social margins anyway. So it just made them doubly exposed to the risk of blame. So, Betty, yes, yep. Yeah, there's a number of ones like that. This is the question is, just outside Perth, we have Bessie Bell and Mary Grey's grave, subject to the Scots ballad associated with an outbreak of plague in the 17th century. Exact year varies between stories. This is two women who took themselves off into seclusion up in Glenalmond, and they live very well until their boyfriends come a visiting and give both of them the plague as a gift. Now, there's actually stories like this from various parts of the country. There's no reason why there isn't actually a factual basis to it. I haven't been able to track it down myself, but I know that there's a similar story down at Thornhill, just west of Doon, and there's another one trying to put it. Oh, it was two girls. It's someplace up in the West Highlands who they took themselves off into wild places, and they survived for the winter months living on black slugs. So it's a nice sort of combination of famine food survival, but also self-isolation. And you do get a whole series of stories of this kind actually from all across Europe. And if you're familiar with the Florentine cases back in the 14th and 15th centuries, this is where the Italian author Boccaccio gets the idea for the Decameron from this group of friends who take themselves away to live in isolation until the plague has died down in the country round about them. And so they're living in the house and telling stories. But it's an attempt through isolating yourself to avoid getting the plague. So yeah, there is likely to be a genuine basis in fact to the story. We're right. The next question from Teresa H is: has the Fortingall plague mound been excavated? And if it was, could it provide useful plague data today? It's not been excavated. We've actually got very, very few plague burial excavations in Scotland. Most of the plague material that we have comes from Leith, and not just the recent South Leith Church excavations. There was a group of plague victims found in one of the chambers within the 16th century, the French fortifications. They were found late in the 19th century. They've been buried with lime and all sorts of things in there. So no modern excavation of those. Could we learn something from the plague pit? Quite probably. It gave us a better idea of the demographic of the population that's falling victim to plague. You know, are we seeing a 50-50 split between male and female? Are we seeing an age differentiation within the burials? Things of that kind. It might, depending on what survives, actually allow us to identify if the 1645 to 8 epidemic was purely bubonic plague, or if there were other things kicking around at the same time. So yeah, there's a lot that we could learn from it. Would we want to do it though? Is a completely separate question. And given that we've got a whole lot of competing priorities for what we spend heritage protection money on these days, excavating a plague burial pit might be the highest in the agenda. Glasgow 1900, yes. It had to be the Glaswegians. You know, everything nasty comes out of Glasgow, I say, as a good Dundonian. Yeah, there was the disinfecting of the coins is actually one of the most interesting aspects of this, because that's something that had been regularly used from the Middle Ages. On each of the foul moors where people are put out, you had a boiling cauldron and a long-handled ladle. So if you were out there in quarantine and you wanted to buy some food, you had to put your money into the cauldron for it to be boiled. It's coin, of course, there's no notes. And then it would be scooped out using a long-handled ladle. And so that in 1900 is a direct hangover from that. Disinfecting all the trams, again, you know, it's the best places to pick up any kind of infectious disease in the late 19th and 20th centuries was on public transport. So the clearing and cleansing of public transport was a very, very serious thing. So, Mike and Carolyn Bell, why did the plague eventually stop? It's one of those big questions. The last big outbreak in the British Isles is 1665, the Great Plague in London. But there was major European outbreaks through the 1720s, 1750s. Marseille is the last Western European epidemic, 1788 Moscow. And there was always a fear that it would spread from those places. So that's why the old laws kept on coming out. But plague has done this for millennia. There is a lot of evidence now for pandemic in the Neolithic. With the isolation of the DNA, we've been able to identify that Yersinia pestis was around and well around about 3,500 BC and killing off entire cultures in Northern Europe at the time. You've got various epidemics through the classical period and then through the early historic, the Great Justinianic plague in the Roman Empire, for example. And so you've got these pulses of plague, and then it recedes. And we cannot really be sure why it recedes. And then it seems to retreat to what are styled plague reservoirs, and then it will re-erupt out of those. And so it may come back, but its last major pandemic was at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. But by that stage, Western public health particularly was at a level that was able to contain it very effectively. And by the middle of the 20th century, with the arrival of antibiotics, it was treatable. So end of the story there. Only dying rats can spread plague via fleas. When all the rats are gone, the process may stop. Yeah, but we've also got, there's a series of problems within that one. One of the key indicators of an outbreak of plague, you're absolutely right, was it's not just rats, it's most rodents. And when you see mass deaths in the rodent population, it almost inevitably meant that there was going to be a spread into the human population very rapidly thereafter, because the fleas are looking for a new host. But you also get the spread of plague in environments where there are no rodent carriers. And it also is happening out with flea breeding cycles. That's another one of the problems that we have with it. So although we know what it is, we know what it does, we know how it is best spread, there are still a lot of questions around how it was able to move so effectively and into places like Iceland, ultimately. And even within the British Isles, you're getting to the northernmost limits of a viable flea breeding cycle. It's usually too short a season for them to be able to function effectively. So there's all sorts of theories come up about houses being overheated in winter in medieval Scotland, and so fleas kept on breeding throughout the winter months and this sort of thing. There's a whole load of theories, and we still have to get a better understanding of how exactly it happened.